They say that the Ganges has the power to wash away a lifetime of sins. But nobody tells you what happens to the weight of those sins once they leave your body. I often wonder if they just sink to the bottom, layering the riverbed with the heavy, dark silt of human regret, or if they float downstream to be shadowed by the sea. For me, the river has never been a place of cleansing. It has always been a giant, liquid clock that stopped ticking 10 years ago. Every time I stand on the banks of Haridwar, I don't remember the touch of the divine. I feel the pull of a cold, watery hand reaching up from the depth to remind me of the half of my soul that stayed behind. I am Neil, a man who has spent a decade living as a shadow of a person who no longer exists. I work as a restorer of old clocks in a small shop in Delhi, surrounded by the rhythmic clicking and chiming of thousands of gears, trying to pretend that time is something I can actually control. My life is quite one, measured in the tiny, intricate moments of brass escapements and the careful application of oil to rusted springs. I am 32 years old, but when I look in a mirror, I see a face that seems to have been eroded by a slow, persistent tide. My hair is thinning, and there is a permanent slouch to my shoulders, as if I am carrying the entire volume of the river on my back. I have a peculiarity that my few friends find strange. I cannot drink water from a clear glass. I always use a heavy, opaque, ceramic kind of mug because I cannot bear to see a reflection looking back at me while I tilt my head to drink it. Reflections are liars, or perhaps they are the only things telling the truth, and I'm not ready to hear what they have to say. Every year, when the heat of the summer begins to bake the streets of Delhi into a shimmering haze, I pack a single bag and board a train for Haridwar. I don't go for festivals and I don't go for the blessings. I go because the river demands an audience. The journey to the holy city is always the same. The train is packed with pilgrims whose eyes are filled with a frantic, desperate hope that I lost a long time ago. They sing bhajans and share sweets, their voice rising over the rhythmic clatter of the tracks, while I sit by the window and watch the landscape transforming from the grey concrete of the city to the lush, unforgiving green of the foothills. I feel the tightening in my chest as the air grows cooler and carries the sharp, metallic scent of the mountains. By the time the train pulls into the station at Haridwar, the noise of the crowd is a physical force. People are pushing and shouting, their bodies forming a dense, heaving mass of orange and white fabric. I move through them like a ghost, unnoticed and untouchable, heading towards the specific ghat where the world ended for me in 2015. It was during the Kumbh Mela of that year that I lost him. Akash. He was my twin, the louder, brighter version of myself. We were 22 at that time, convinced that the world was a map we were destined to redraw. We had come to the river not out of pity but out of a youthful curiosity to see the spectacle of millions of people seeking salvation. The crowd that day was a monster, a living thing with 1,000 heads and no mercy. We were holding on to each other's shirts, trying to stay together as the human tide pushed us towards the water's edge for the evening prayer. One moment, his hand was on my arm, and the next, a surge of people from behind knocked us off our feet. I fell towards the stone steps, my head ringing with the sound of 1,000 bells, and when I reached out for him, there was only the cold, rushing embrace of water. He didn't scream, He just slipped under the surface and the river closed over him like a curtain being drawn shut. I spent 3 days screaming his name until my throat bled, but the Ganges didn't give him back. Finding a place during the peak of pilgrim season is usually a nightmare, but I have a standing arrangement with a small guest house tucked away in a narrow alley behind the Harkipur. The owner is an old man named Panditji, whose family has lived in the city for generations. He is a small, withered man with a voice that sounds like dry parchment being folded, and he always wears a string of Rudraksh beads that are worn smooth by years of prayers. He doesn't ask me why I come back every year, and he doesn't try to offer me the empty comfort of religious platitudes. He simply hands me the key to the same small room on the top floor and tells me that the water is high this year. He has a way of looking at me that suggests he can see the silt in my lungs, a silent acknowledgement of survivor's guilt that has become my permanent companion. This year, as I walked from the station towards the guest house, I was joined by a companion of a different sort, a stray dog, a large, shaggy mutt with fur the color of wet river sand. He began to follow me from the main market. He had a notched ear and a strange, intelligent look in his amber eyes that seemed to bypass the usual begging for food. He didn't bark or nudge my hand. He simply walked 3 paces behind me, matching my slow, deliberate stride. When I stopped to buy a bottle of water, he sat patiently on the hot pavement, his head tilted as if he were listening to my conversation only he could hear. I felt a strange connection to him, a sense that was also a creature defined by what he had lost. I named him Sagar, after the sea that the river eventually finds, and he accepted the name with a single, slow wag of his tail. Sagar followed me all the way to Panditji's doorstep and waited outside while I went in to get my keys. When I came back out to go to the river, he was still there, sitting like a silent sentinel. We walked together towards the ghat, moving through the labyrinth of shops selling brass idols, colorful powders, and plastic canisters for carrying holy water. The noise was a chaotic symphony of bells, chanting, and the constant underlying roar of the river. As we drew closer to the water, the temperature dropped significantly, a cold breath rising from the snow-fed currents of Ganga. Sagar's fur began to stand on the end, and he let out a low, vibrating growl that wasn't directed at any person but at the air itself. He felt the wrongness of the place, the way the atmosphere seemed to thin and wrap near the edge of the ghat. He reached the spot where Akash had disappeared. It was a small, relatively quiet ledge away from the main platform where the tourists would gather for clicking some pictures. The stones here were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and persistent licking of the water. I sat on the edge, my foot dangling just inches above the rushing surface, while Sagar lay down beside me, his amber eyes fixed on the center of the river. I watched the water move, a powerful, unstoppable force that seemed to be flowing in two directions at once. The surface rushing towards the plains, and a deep, darker current that felt like it was pulling backwards towards the mountains. I pulled a small silver coin from my pocket, a token Akash and I had found in our grandfather's attic, and held it tightly in my palm. This was the ritual I performed every year, a conversation with a silent river, a plea for a sign that he was still there, somewhere beneath the surface tension. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the water that looked like reaching fingers. The evening prayer had started at the main ghat, and the sound of chanting echoed off the stone buildings, creating a hypnotic rhythmic pulse in the air. Thousands of small leaf boats carrying flickering lamps were being launched into the river, creating a constellation of artificial stars that bobbed up and spun in the current. I watched one of these lamps as it drifted towards my ledge. It hit a small whirlpool and began to spin in circles, the flames dancing frantically before it was suddenly extinguished by a splash of cold water. In that moment of sudden darkness, I looked at the surface of the river directly beneath my feet. The water was momentarily still, acting as a perfect dark mirror for the sky above. At first, I saw only my own face, the tired eyes, the thinning hair, the heavy lines of a decade of grief. But as I stared, the reflection began to change. The face looking back at me started to smooth out, the wrinkles disappearing and the hair growing thick and dark again. The slouch in the shoulders vanished, replaced by youthful, energetic posture. It was my face, but it was a version of me that hadn't aged a single day since 2015. My heart stopped, cold hand of terror gripping my throat. I wasn't looking at myself, I was looking at Akash. He was there, just inches beneath the surface, his face illuminated by soft, internal glow that didn't come from the lamps. He looked exactly as he had the moment River took him, wearing the same faded blue shirt, his eyes wide and filled with a strange, calm curiosity. I didn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I watched as the reflection of my brother slowly raised his hand, his fingers pressing against the underside of the water surface. It looked like he was pushing against this thin sheet of flexible glass. The water didn't ripple, it distorted under his touch. I looked up at the crowd on the ghat, expecting to see people pointing and screaming at the miracle or the horror occurring at my feet. But the pilgrims were moving past me as they always did, their faces filled with their own private sorrows and hopes. They didn't see me. Even Sagar, who was standing now with his teeth bared and a low whine in his throat, seemed to be reacting to a presence he couldn't quite see. It was a vision intended only for me, maybe a private invitation to a world that shouldn't exist. Akash leaned closer to the surface, his lips moving as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. The water seemed to vibrate with the frequency of his voice, pointed towards the deep center of the river, and then made a beckoning gesture, his eyes never leaving mine. It wasn't a signal for help, it was an invitation to join him. I reached out my hand, my fingers trembling as they neared the freezing water. I wanted to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin and the reality of his existence. But as my fingertip broke the surface, the reflection shattered into 1,000 jagged ripples. The image of my brother vanished, replaced by the dark, churning reality of Ganga. The cold of the water was absolute, a piercing, numbing sensation that traveled up my arms and settled in my heart. I pulled back my hand, gasping for air, and realized that the river hasn't just taken him, it had kept him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small room at the guest house, watching the slow rotation of the ceiling fan and listening to Sagar pace the hallway outside my door. My mind was a chaotic storm of questions and impossible theories. I kept seeing Akash's face, so young and unchanged, looking at me from beneath the water. How was it possible? He should have been a skeleton by now, lost to the currents or consumed by the river's life. But he looked more alive than I ever did. He looked like he was the one who had survived, and I was the one who was fading away. I thought about the way his hand had pressed against the surface tension, as if the water were not a liquid at all, but a solid membrane separating two different versions of reality. I spent the next morning at the city's ancient library, a dusty, neglected building filled with crumbling manuscript and a smell of slowly decaying paper. I was looking for anything that could explain what I had seen. Local legends, myth of the Ganga, stories of people who had seen the death in the water. I found an old text written by a wandering ascetic from the 17th century. He spoke of the river not as a body of water but as a liquid timeline. He described the Ganga as a celestial vein that flowed through multiple dimensions simultaneously. To the living, it was a river, but to the dead, it was a road. He wrote that at certain points, like Haridwar or Varanasi, the surface tension of the river acted as a thinning membrane where the parallel worlds could occasionally overlap. He called it the surface of the reversal, a plane where the one who stayed behind and the one who went ahead could see each other across the divide. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If the river was a membrane between dimensions, then the dead weren't really dead in the way we understood it. They were simply on the other side of a curtain. Akash wasn't a ghost. He was a version of me that had stayed in a world where I was the one who drowned. The reflection I had seen wasn't a reflection of my brother. It was a reflection of a reality where I was the one under the water. The non-aging wasn't a supernatural curse. It was because time on the other side of the surface flowed differently, or perhaps didn't flow at all. He wasn't waiting for me to save him. He was waiting for me to acknowledge that I was the one who was out of place. I felt a wave of cosmic horror wash over me. I wasn't just grieving my brother, I was a man living in the wrong timeline, the survivor of a tragedy that was supposed to claim us both, or claim neither. I returned to the ghat in the afternoon, the heat of the sun doing nothing to warm the cold dread in my stomach. Sagar was waiting for me, his amber eyes filled with a weary, knowing look as we sat in the same spot and looked down at the water. It was clear today. The sediment settled and I could see the stones on the riverbed several feet below. I stared until my eyes burned, and slowly the image began to resolve again. It wasn't just Akash this time. I saw the entire ghat mirrored in the water, but it was a version of ghat from 10 years ago. I saw the younger versions of the pilgrims, the brighter colors of the stalls, and there, standing on the step with a look of absolute, soul-crushing grief, was my brother, Akash. He was older in the reflection, He was 32, with graying hair and a permanent slouch on his shoulder. He was looking down at the water, and in the reflection of his own world, he saw me, the 22-year-old Neil, who had just been swallowed by the river. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We were both anchors for each other in this world. In this world, I had died, and his grief had kept my spirit trapped in the water of his reality. In my world, he had died, and my grief had kept his spirit trapped in mine. The ghosts we saw in the reflections weren't inhabitants of a spirit world. They were the versions of ourselves that had lost to the other. The Ganga was the bridge, the liquid medium that allowed these two grieving timelines to touch. Akash in the water reached out again, his fingers tracing the underside of the surface. I saw a tear fall from his eyes. In the water, the tear didn't mix with the river. It floated upward like a tiny, translucent pearl defying gravity. The river was flowing upwards in his world, a reversal of nature that mirrored the reversal of our faith. Sagar let out a sharp, urgent bark, snapping me out of my trance. I realized I was leaning dangerously far over the edge, my face only inches from the water. The pressure coming from the surface was immense, a magnetic pull that wanted to draw me into the silence of the other side. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to just let go, to fall into the water and find the world where I was young again, where I was the one who was missed. It seemed so much easier than living this half life of clocks and grey dilly mornings. I could swap places with him. I could become reflection, and he could step out onto the dry stones and breathe the air of 2026. I reached out both hands, pressing them against the cold, vibrating surface of the river. The river felt like a heavy silk, resisting my touch but also inviting it. I could feel the heartbeat of the river, a slow, deep throb that matched the pace of shifting timelines. Akash's face was so close now that I could see the individual lashes of his eyes. He wasn't beckoning me to join him. He was pleading with me to let him go. I understood then that our mutual grief was a chain. As long as I came back here every year, as long as I refused to move on and kept looking for him in the water, in his own world, I was the reason he couldn't find peace. My survivor's guilt wasn't just a burden for me, it was a prison for him. The cosmic horror wasn't that he was dead, it was that he was perpetually dying because I wouldn't let him be gone. I looked at Sagar, and he was staring at me with a profound, human-like intensity. He stepped forward and grabbed the sleeve of my shirt in his teeth, pulling me back from the edge with a strength that was surprising for his size. He was trying to save me from the same mistake I had been making for decades. He was the guardian of the threshold, a creature who understood that the living belonged to the air and the dead belonged to the memory. I looked back at the water one last time, and the image of Akash began to fade, the surface becoming dark and opaque as a cloud passed over the sun. The invitation was still there, a silent promise of reunion, but the price was eternal entrapment for both of us. So I had to make a choice. I could drown in the past, or I could learn to live in a world that was missing its other half.